My boyfriend's friend convinced him I was too dumb for him because I was just a lab tech. So I ended her career. I'd been dating Nathan for 2 years and everything was great. We met at trivia night. Both aerospace engineers, both loved hiking and documentaries. I worked at a research lab designing satellite components while he did consulting for aviation companies. We had this easy rhythm where we'd cook together talking about our projects, help each other with problems, just genuinely enjoyed each other's minds. Then Nathan reconnected with his high school friend Melissa at some reunion. She was getting her PhD in theoretical physics and immediately started joining our hangouts. At first I tried being friendly. She'd talk about quantum mechanics and I'd ask questions, genuinely interested. But she'd answer like she was explaining to a 5-year-old, then turn to Nathan and say, "Wasn't it cute how I tried to understand?" Nathan would laugh it off, but I noticed she only did this when he was watching. When we went to dinner, she'd steer conversations to her research, then apologize for boring me with smart people stuff. I have 2 master's degrees. One night we're at trivia, and the category was space exploration. I answered every question right, since that's literally my job. Melissa told Nathan I probably just memorized facts without understanding them. Nathan actually agreed and said maybe we should give other teams a chance. I let it go, but started noticing Nathan questioning things he never had before. Like when I fixed our router, he asked if I really knew what I was doing or just got lucky. When I helped optimize code for his project, he double-checked it with Melissa. She told him there were errors. There weren't. The breaking point was Nathan's company party. I'm talking to his boss about propulsion systems when Melissa walks over and tells the boss I'm Nathan's girlfriend who works as a lab tech. The boss said he thought I was the engineer who published that paper on thermal management. Melissa laughed and said that must be someone else with my name since the math in that paper was pretty advanced. I corrected her, but she'd already moved Nathan away. In the car home, Nathan said Melissa was worried about our compatibility, that relationships work better when people are intellectual equals, and maybe I'd be happier with someone at my own level. I asked what level that was. He said Melissa noticed I struggled with abstract concepts and relied too much on practical application. This woman had convinced my boyfriend I was too dumb for him. I asked Nathan if he agreed with her. He said she'd made some valid points about our conversations being surface level. We'd spent last week discussing the philosophical implications of sending consciousness to Mars, but sure, surface level. I knew exactly what was happening, but decided to play the long game. Started acting confused when Nathan explained things, asked Melissa to slow down when she talked, even bought a bunch of those pop science books and left them around. Melissa ate it up, started calling me Nathan's sweet, simple girlfriend. Meanwhile, I started working on something special. See, Melissa's PhD advisor was Dr. Harrison, who I'd collaborated with on 3 papers. He didn't know she was friends with Nathan. I reached out about a new project involving quantum applications in satellite navigation. He was interested, and we started working together. Melissa had no idea her advisor was sending me her research to review, since my practical experience could strengthen her theoretical work. Here's the thing about her research. It was derivative. She'd taken existing frameworks and repackaged them with fancy math that obscured rather than illuminated. Her code was inefficient, and her conclusions didn't account for real-world variables. I wrote a thorough review pointing out every flaw, every missed citation, every place where practical application would prove her theories wrong. Dr. Harrison was horrified he'd missed all this. Then I found something worse. Whole paragraphs lifted from obscure Russian papers without attribution. Not enough to catch with standard plagiarism software, but enough to end a career. I documented everything and sent it to Dr. Harrison with my deep concerns about academic integrity. He called me immediately. The review board met that week. Melissa got called in thinking it was about her upcoming defense. Instead, they presented her with my findings. She tried arguing the similarities were coincidental, but I'd found 17 instances across 4 papers. Her funding got pulled immediately. She had 2 weeks to clean out her office. Nathan called me panicking because Melissa was having a breakdown saying someone sabotaged her. She couldn't figure out who since she'd made enemies of most grad students by constantly correcting them. Nathan said she needed support and asked if I could help despite everything. I said of course and went over with cookies and tea. Melissa's office smelled like stale coffee and printer toner. The space was barely bigger than a closet, crammed with bookshelves and papers stacked in messy piles on every surface. She sat hunched over her desk with her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking. The tea I'd brought sat untouched next to her laptop, steam rising in thin curls. I settled into the plastic chair across from her and watched her cry, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. She kept saying the same things over and over, how someone must have set her up, how the plagiarism findings were impossible, how she'd never stolen anything in her life. I nodded and made sympathetic sounds while my hands gripped my knees under the desk. Every time she looked up at me with those red, swollen eyes, I had to fight to keep my face concerned instead of satisfied. This was exactly what I'd wanted, what I'd carefully planned and worked toward for weeks. But sitting here watching her world collapse felt different from I'd expected. Not bad different, just strange. She wiped her nose with a tissue and started going through the review board's findings again, pointing at her computer screen like I could help her find some error in their logic. I leaned forward and looked at the document she was showing me, the same document I'd written myself and pretended to read it for the first time. She asked if I saw anything wrong with their conclusions, and I told her it looked pretty thorough. Her face crumpled again and she put her head back in her hands. My phone buzzed in my pocket while Melissa was still crying. I pulled it out and saw Nathan's name on the screen. The message asked if Melissa had said anything about who might have reported her. I stared at the words for a long moment, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. He had no idea. He was texting his girlfriend asking for information while I sat across from his friend whose career I'd just destroyed. I typed back that she was too upset to talk coherently, which wasn't a lie, and suggested he give her some space while the investigation continued. He sent back a worried face emoji and said he'd check in with her tomorrow. I put my phone away and looked at Melissa, who was now staring blankly at her computer screen. She asked if I thought Nathan would still want to be friends with her after this. I told her of course he would, that this didn't change who she was as a person. The words felt hollow coming out of my mouth, but she seemed to take comfort in them. She thanked me for coming over and said she didn't know what she'd do without support right now. I stayed for another 20 minutes, making tea and listening to her talk about her research and how many years of work were now completely wasted. When I finally left, she hugged me at the door and told me I was a good friend. The next week passed in a weird blur. Nathan kept texting me updates about Melissa, how she wasn't answering his calls or messages, how worried he was about her. He said she'd always been proud and this must be killing her. I agreed and said maybe she just needed time to process everything. We were sitting on his couch on Wednesday night when he brought it up again, asking if I thought he should drive over to her apartment and check on her. I told him that might make things worse, that she was probably too embarrassed to face anyone from her old life right now. He nodded but kept checking his phone like she might suddenly respond. On Thursday, he asked if I'd heard from her and I said no. Friday, he wondered out loud if maybe he should have seen the signs that something was wrong with her research. I bit my tongue and reminded him that he wasn't a theoretical physicist, that he couldn't have known. He seemed relieved by this and dropped the subject. By Saturday, he was asking me repeatedly if I thought she'd be okay, if academic fraud was something people recovered from, if her career was really over, or if she could start again somewhere else. I had to sit there and pretend I was equally concerned about her well-being, nodding and saying supportive things, while inside I felt this weird mix of triumph and guilt. The guilt surprised me. I'd expected to feel purely satisfied, but instead I kept seeing her face in that tiny office, the way her hands had shaken when she showed me the review board's findings. Monday morning, I went back to work at the research lab and tried to focus on my actual job. Kara found me in the break room around 10, pouring my third cup of coffee. She leaned against the counter and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but she kept looking at me with this concerned expression. She said I seemed different lately, more confident but also more guarded, like I was holding something back. I laughed it off and said work had just been stressful. She asked if everything was okay with Nathan, and I felt my smile freeze on my face. The question hit different from I'd expected because suddenly I was thinking about what all of this had revealed about my relationship. Nathan had believed Melissa over me. He'd questioned my intelligence, my competence, my ability to understand basic concepts in my own field. He'd done it so easily, so quickly. Like 2 years of knowing me counted for nothing compared to a few weeks of Melissa's comments. I realized I hadn't actually processed any of that yet. I'd been so focused on destroying Melissa that I hadn't stopped to think about what it meant that Nathan was, so ready to believe I was too dumb for him. Kara was still waiting for an answer, so I told her things with Nathan were complicated right now. She asked if I wanted to talk about it, but I said no. She squeezed my shoulder and went back to her desk. That night, Nathan came over to my apartment with takeout. We ate on the couch and watched some documentary about deep-sea creatures. Halfway through, he paused it and turned to me with this serious expression. He said he'd been thinking a lot about what Melissa had said regarding our intellectual compatibility. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. He continued, saying he was starting to wonder if maybe he'd been unfair to me. I asked what he meant by unfair. He shifted uncomfortably and said some of the things Melissa had pointed out, about me struggling with abstract concepts. Maybe those weren't actually true. Maybe he'd just been seeing what she wanted him to see. I felt anger rising in my chest like heat. He was only questioning his behavior now because Melissa had disappeared and couldn't reinforce her narrative anymore. Not because he'd recognized the problem himself. Not because he'd thought about it and realized how insulting his behavior had been. But because his source of information was gone. I asked him if he actually believed I struggled with abstract concepts. He hesitated and said he didn't know, that Melissa had been convincing. The anger got hotter. I asked if he remembered our conversation about consciousness and Mars exploration. He nodded. I asked if that had seemed surface level to him at the time, before Melissa told him it was. He looked uncomfortable and admitted it hadn't. I set my food down and stood up. Nathan asked where I was going and I told him nowhere. I just needed to move. I walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot below. The decision formed in my mind fully shaped, like it had been waiting there all along. I turned around and told him I needed to tell him something. He put down his food too and sat forward. I explained calmly how I'd reviewed Melissa's research for Dr. Harrison, how I'd found the plagiarism, how I'd documented everything that led to her getting kicked out of the PhD program. The words came out steady and clear. I told him about reaching out to Dr. Harrison, about the quantum navigation project that was just an excuse to get access to her work, about finding the lifted paragraphs from Russian papers. I explained how I'd written the review that destroyed her career, how I'd been the one who reported her to the Academic Integrity Board. Nathan's face went completely white. He stared at me like I'd just told him I'd committed murder. The silence stretched between us for what felt like forever. Finally, he asked why I would do something so destructive. His voice was quiet. but I could hear the shock underneath. I walked back to the couch and sat down, keeping space between us. I reminded him of the router incident, when he'd asked if I really knew what I was doing or just got lucky. I listed the code review where he'd checked my work with Melissa even though I'd been programming longer than she had. I brought up the company party where she'd told his boss I was just a lab tech, where she'd laughed at the idea that I could have written that thermal management paper. I described the car ride home where he'd told me maybe I'd be happier with someone at my own level. I went through every single time he'd questioned my intelligence based on her lies. Each instance came out of my mouth like evidence in a trial. His face got paler with every example. When I finished, he tried to say something, but I held up my hand. I asked him about the conversation where he'd agreed that maybe we should give other teams a chance at trivia, because I probably just memorized facts. He closed his mouth and looked down at his hands. He started trying to defend himself, saying Melissa was convincing and had a PhD, that she seemed like an authority on intellectual matters. I cut him off before he could finish. I asked if my 2 master's degrees weren't convincing enough, if my published research papers weren't authority enough, if working in aerospace engineering for 6 years wasn't proof enough that I understood abstract concepts. My voice got louder with each question. I asked if he'd needed Melissa to tell him I was smart, or if maybe he should have figured that out from dating me for 2 years. The hurt on his face was obvious now. He looked like I'd slapped him. Good. He was finally understanding the depth of what he'd done to our relationship. He opened his mouth and closed it again. No words coming out. I waited. He finally said he didn't know what to say, that hearing it all laid out like that made him realize how badly he'd messed up. I told him it wasn't just that he'd messed up. It was that he'd been so easily convinced I was incompetent, that some woman he hadn't seen since high school could show up, and within weeks make him doubt my basic intelligence. Nathan asked if the plagiarism was real, or if I'd made it up to destroy her. The question made me so angry I had to take a deep breath before answering. I was genuinely offended that he was still doubting my professional integrity even now. I got up and went to my laptop, opened my email, and pulled up the files I'd sent to Dr. Harrison. I showed him the original Russian papers side by side with Melissa's work. I pointed out the identical paragraphs, the same sentence structures, the lifted equations. I walked him through all 17 instances across her 4 papers. I showed him how she'd changed just enough words to avoid automatic plagiarism detection, but kept the core ideas and frameworks without attribution. I made him read the passages himself, comparing them line by line. I watched his face as he realized her fraud was completely real, that I hadn't fabricated anything, that I'd just done my job as a reviewer and found what was actually there. He sat back and put his hands over his face. He said he was sorry, that he should never have questioned whether I'd made it up. I closed my laptop and told him the plagiarism was real, but that didn't change why I'd looked for it in the first place. We spent the next 3 hours talking through everything. Nathan apologized over and over, saying he didn't know how he'd let himself get manipulated like that. He admitted he'd gotten caught up in Melissa's confidence and his own insecurity about not having a PhD himself. He said he'd always felt like maybe he wasn't smart enough, like his consulting work was less impressive than research, and Melissa had played right into that fear. She'd made him feel included in some elite intellectual club by agreeing with her assessment of me. I listened to all of it and tried to figure out if I could forgive someone who was so easily convinced I was incompetent. Part of me understood that insecurity makes people do stupid things, but another part of me couldn't stop thinking about how quickly he'd turned on me, how readily he'd accepted her narrative. He asked what I was thinking, and I told him I didn't know yet. I said I needed time to process everything, to figure out if trust could be rebuilt after something like this. He nodded and said he understood, that he'd wait as long as I needed. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the documentary still paused on the TV, the takeout containers cold on the coffee table between us. I left Nathan's place after midnight and drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The conversation kept replaying in my head, how he'd looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time in months. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on the couch in the dark for an hour just trying to process everything. The next morning, I texted Nathan that I needed space to think about us. He responded immediately asking how much time I needed, and I told him honestly that I didn't know. He showed up at my door that evening with 2 boxes, his face pale and tired-looking. He'd packed up his things from my apartment without me having to ask. I watched him carry his spare work clothes from my closet, his extra toiletries from the bathroom, the book he'd been reading that lived on my nightstand. He moved quietly and carefully, like he was trying not to disturb anything. When he finished, he stood in my doorway holding both boxes and asked if this was really what I wanted. I told him it was what I needed right now. He nodded and left without arguing. After he was gone, I walked through my apartment, noticing all the empty spaces where his stuff had been. The bathroom counter looked bigger without his electric razor. The closet had a gap where his jackets used to hang. But weirdly, the apartment felt more like mine than it had in months, like I'd been sharing it with someone who didn't really see me, and now I had room to breathe again. 3 days later, I was at work running simulations when an email from Dr. Harrison popped up. He thanked me for the thorough review of Melissa's research and said my attention to detail had been invaluable. Then he mentioned that 2 other graduate students had come forward with concerns about collaborative projects they'd worked on with Melissa. Apparently, my review had opened up a bigger investigation into her entire academic career. I sat staring at that email for a long time. Part of me felt satisfied, like I'd exposed something that needed to be exposed. But another part felt guilty knowing I'd triggered this whole thing. If I hadn't gone looking, if I hadn't been so angry about what she'd done to my relationship, would anyone have ever found the plagiarism? Would those other students have spoken up? I closed my email and tried to focus on work, but couldn't stop thinking about how one review had destroyed someone's entire career path. That Friday after work, Kara found me still at my desk at 7 p.m., staring at simulation results I wasn't really seeing. She asked if I wanted to grab drinks, and I said yes without even thinking about it. We ended up at this bar near the lab that we'd been to a few times for team happy hours. After we ordered, Kara asked what was going on because I'd seemed off all week. I hadn't planned to tell anyone the whole story, but it all came spilling out. The way Melissa had undermined me, how Nathan had believed her, finding the plagiarism, the academic investigation, everything. I expected Kara to be shocked or maybe judge me for what I'd done. Instead, she listened carefully, and then said I hadn't fabricated anything, that I'd just exposed fraud that would have been discovered eventually. She pointed out that Melissa's treatment of me had been its own kind of sabotage, trying to destroy my relationship and my boyfriend's respect for my work. Kara said if the plagiarism was real, then Melissa had done this to herself, that I'd just been the one who found it. Hearing someone else say that made me feel slightly better about the whole thing. The next Tuesday, Nathan texted asking if we could talk again. He said he'd been thinking a lot about his behavior, and realized the problem wasn't just about Melissa. He admitted he'd always felt kind of intimidated by my practical skills and hands-on expertise. That insecurity had made him vulnerable when someone came along claiming theoretical knowledge was superior. He said he wanted to talk more if I was willing. I stared at that text for an hour before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it and just move on. But another part needed to understand how we'd gotten to this point. I agreed to meet him for coffee that Saturday. When I got to the coffee shop, Nathan was already there at a corner table. He had a notebook in front of him, which seemed weird. After we ordered, he slid the notebook across to me. He'd written out a list of every time he remembered questioning my intelligence or abilities over the past 6 months. There were way more instances than I'd realized. Times he'd asked if I was sure about something technical. Moments where he'd double-checked my work. Conversations where he'd explained things I already knew. Some of them I'd completely forgotten about because they'd seemed small at the time. But seeing them all written out together showed a pattern that had started way before Melissa showed up. She hadn't created the problem. She'd just made it worse. I read through the whole list feeling this mix of hurt and anger building up again. Nathan watched me and didn't say anything until I finished. Then he asked if I thought we could fix this or if the damage was too deep. We spent the next 2 hours talking about our relationship foundation and whether it had ever been as solid as I'd thought. Nathan acknowledged he had serious insecurity issues around not having a PhD and doing consulting instead of research. He said he'd always worried he wasn't smart enough compared to people doing theoretical work. When Melissa came along talking about abstract concepts and quantum mechanics, it had made him feel included in some intellectual club. Agreeing with her assessment of me had been a way of proving he belonged in that space. I told him that was a pretty terrible reason to undervalue someone you supposedly loved. He agreed and said he knew it was messed up, that he needed to work on trusting his actual experiences with people, instead of just believing whoever sounded the most confident or had the most credentials. I asked if he really thought he could change that pattern because it seemed pretty deeply rooted. He said he didn't know, but he wanted to try if I was willing to give him the chance. I told him I needed more time to think about whether I could trust him again after this. Whether knowing he'd been so easily convinced I was incompetent was something I could get past. We left the coffee shop without making any decisions about our future. That week, I kept thinking about everything and realized I needed outside perspective from someone who understood the professional side of what I'd done. I emailed Julian Lozano, my former professor from grad school who I'd stayed in touch with. I explained the whole situation, how I'd found Melissa's plagiarism while reviewing her work for Dr. Harrison, and asked about the ethics of it all. Julian called me the next day instead of emailing back. He listened to the full story and then said something that surprised me. He pointed out that exposing academic fraud was actually an ethical obligation for anyone who discovered it. That regardless of my personal reasons for looking closely at Melissa's work, finding and reporting plagiarism was the right thing to do. He said the academic system relied on people being honest about these things. If I'd found the fraud and not reported it, that would have been the ethical problem. My motivations for reviewing her research in the first place didn't change the fact that what I'd found was real and needed to be addressed. Talking to Julian helped me feel less guilty about the whole thing. 2 weeks after Nathan moved his stuff out, I got an email that made my stomach drop. It was from Melissa. The subject line just said, "I know it was you." I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won out. Her email wasn't angry like I'd expected. Instead, it was kind of defeated and sad. She'd figured out my connection to Dr. Harrison somehow, probably by going through his correspondence after everything fell apart. She wrote that she understood now that I'd been the one who reviewed her work and found all the problems. But then she said something that surprised me. She acknowledged the plagiarism was real, that she'd convinced herself the similarities to those Russian papers were just coincidental, because the ideas seemed obvious to her. But when faced with all 17 instances laid out together, she couldn't deny it anymore. She said she'd gotten lazy and sloppy, taking shortcuts because she was behind on her research timeline. She knew it was wrong, but had convinced herself it wasn't that bad. The email ended with her saying she didn't blame me for reporting it because it was the truth. I read that email 3 times trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me had expected her to be furious and accusatory. This acceptance and acknowledgement of her own fraud was somehow harder to process. I didn't respond to Melissa's email, but I did forward it to Nathan. He needed to see that his friend had been both a fraud and someone who deliberately tried to destroy our relationship. He called me within 10 minutes of me sending it, his voice shaking. He kept apologizing again, saying he finally understood the full picture of what had happened, that Melissa had manipulated him while being academically dishonest the whole time. He said he felt stupid for not seeing it earlier, for believing her over me. I told him I appreciated the apology, but I still didn't know what it meant for us. We talked for another hour about everything that had happened. By the end of the call, Nathan asked if I'd be willing to try couples counseling. He said he recognized we had serious trust and communication problems that he couldn't fix on his own. That if there was any chance of saving our relationship, we needed professional help to work through it. I was surprised he suggested it because Nathan had always been kind of skeptical about therapy, but I agreed to try it because I still wasn't ready to completely give up on us. We started seeing a therapist the following week. The first session was awkward and uncomfortable, both of us sitting on opposite ends of this beige couch trying to explain what had brought us there. The therapist asked a lot of questions about our relationship history and the specific incidents with Melissa. Over the next few sessions, she helped us identify patterns we'd both missed. She pointed out that Nathan's insecurity about his education and career had led him to undervalue practical expertise while overvaluing theoretical knowledge and academic credentials. That dynamic had made our relationship vulnerable to someone like Melissa, who presented herself as intellectually superior. The therapist also made me look at my own behavior, how I'd chosen revenge instead of just confronting the problem directly, how I'd played into Melissa's perception of me as less intelligent instead of standing up for myself earlier. She said we both had work to do on communication and trust if we wanted to rebuild anything real. Nathan started working on his insecurity issues and learning to value different kinds of intelligence and expertise. I worked on being more direct about my feelings instead of letting resentment build up until I did something destructive. It was slow progress, and some sessions were really hard, with both of us getting defensive or upset. But gradually, things started feeling a little better between us. 3 months passed, and things with Nathan got better, but different. We talked more about what we were feeling instead of just assuming we understood each other. When I felt hurt by something he said, I told him right away instead of letting it build up. When he felt insecure about his work or our relationship, he actually said so instead of taking it out on me in weird, indirect ways. But there was this new carefulness between us that hadn't been there before. Like we were both watching for signs that the other person might doubt us again. I caught myself sometimes waiting to see if he'd question my judgment on something, and I could tell he was doing the same thing, watching to see if I was angry or planning something. It wasn't bad exactly, just different from the easy trust we used to have. We were building something more honest, but it took more work and attention than before. Then my boss called me into her office on a Tuesday afternoon. I thought maybe I'd made some mistake on the satellite component testing, but instead she told me they were promoting me to senior engineer. The position came with a significant raise and my own team to lead on the next generation navigation systems project. I sat there kind of stunned because I'd been so focused on the situation with Nathan and Melissa that I hadn't even realized the promotion cycle was happening. My boss said the decision was easy because my published research and technical contributions over the past year had been outstanding. I thanked her and walked back to my desk feeling this weird mix of pride and relief. That night I told Nathan about the promotion, and he immediately pulled me into a hug and said he was so proud of me. He insisted on throwing me a celebration dinner that weekend and invited a bunch of our friends and some of his coworkers. At the dinner, he kept telling people about my research papers and technical expertise without me even bringing it up. He'd mention specific projects I'd worked on and explain why they were important. It felt like a test we were both passing, him showing he valued my work, and me letting him celebrate my success without wondering if he had ulterior motives. A few weeks after that, Kara pulled me aside at work during lunch. She had this uncomfortable look on her face and said she'd heard something through academic networks about Melissa. Apparently, she'd left the PhD program completely, not just taking time off but actually withdrawing. She'd moved back to her hometown somewhere in Ohio to work in her family's business, something to do with commercial real estate. Kara said she thought I should know since the whole situation had been so messy. I felt this complicated knot in my stomach hearing that news. Part of me felt satisfied that Melissa had faced real consequences for her fraud and for trying to destroy my relationship. She'd been exposed as a fake and lost the career she'd been so smug about. But another part of me felt uncomfortable with how completely her life had fallen apart. I'd exposed real plagiarism and bad research. That was true. But I'd also done it specifically to hurt her because of what she'd done to me. The severity of her fall, losing everything she'd worked toward and having to leave academia entirely, felt heavier than I'd expected it to feel. I thanked Kara for telling me and went back to work, but I kept thinking about it for days after. Nathan and I talked about Melissa's situation that weekend. I told him what Kara had said and admitted I felt weird about it. He said he understood why I'd done what I did, and that Melissa had brought the consequences on herself through her own dishonesty. But he also said he knew I probably felt conflicted about being the one who'd triggered everything. We decided to keep working on our relationship, to stay together and keep going to therapy and building something more honest than what we'd had before. Both of us had changed because of what happened. I knew now that I was capable of calculated revenge, of planning and executing someone's downfall in a really deliberate way, and that was uncomfortable knowledge to have about myself. Nathan knew he was capable of betraying someone he loved, Not through deliberate cruelty, but through weakness and insecurity, and letting someone else manipulate his perceptions. We were building something more real than the easy rhythm we used to share. It was harder work and less comfortable, but it felt more solid somehow. Like we actually knew who we were now and were choosing each other anyway, despite our flaws and capacity for hurting each other. The wariness was still there, but so was something deeper. A commitment to being honest even when it was difficult and trusting each other even though we both knew trust could be broken.